The eviction notice trembled in Sarah Martinez's hands like a death sentence written on county letterhead. 30 days. That's all she had left before the sheriff would come knocking, before her 2 children would watch their belongings get stacked on the sidewalk like unwanted garage sale items. The paper crinkled as her grip tightened, the sound echoing through their cramped apartment where the heat had been shut off 3 days ago, and the refrigerator hummed its final song on borrowed electricity. "Mama, I'm hungry." 7-year-old Emma's voice cut through the February morning silence, small and trusting in that way that made Sarah's heart fracture a little more each day. Her daughter stood in the doorway wearing mismatched socks and a sweater with holes that Sarah had been meaning to mend for months, back when she still believed things would get better, back when she still had thread. "Just a minute, baby." Sarah folded the notice and slipped it into her purse, that worn leather bag she'd carried since her wedding day 8 years ago. Back then, it had been filled with hope and lipstick and the kind of small treasures that young wives collect. Now it contained food stamps, overdue bills, and exactly $1,043 in cash, the last remnants of her savings, her emergency fund, her everything. 10-year-old Marcus appeared beside his sister, his dark eyes too old for his face, already learning the quiet mathematics of poverty. He'd stopped asking for things months ago, had learned to make his school lunch last 2 meals, had gotten good at pretending he wasn't embarrassed when other kids talked about their weekend plans or new video games. He was becoming the man of the house in ways that broke Sarah's heart, taking responsibility that should never belong to a child. "The lights are going to get turned off today, aren't they?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but small. He'd overheard the phone call yesterday, had seen Sarah's face crumple when the automated voice explained the final disconnection notice. Sarah knelt down and pulled both children close, breathing in the scent of their unwashed hair, feeling the sharp angles of their too thin bodies. When had she last been able to afford the good shampoo? When had their clothes started hanging loose? The questions stacked up like unpaid bills, each one a reminder of how far they'd fallen. "We're going to figure this out," she whispered into their hair, the same promise she'd been making for 6 months. Her phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, David's name lighting up the screen like a taunt. "Sarah?" David's voice carried that familiar note of impatience, as if her problems were an inconvenience to his new life. "Linda's parents are having their anniversary party this weekend. The kids need to look presentable." Linda, his new girlfriend. Sarah closed her eyes and counted to 3. "They don't have anything appropriate to wear, David. And you're 3 months behind on support." "Don't start with that again. You know I'm between jobs. Besides, Linda's parents are important people, real estate developers. They might have opportunities for someone willing to work hard." The irony wasn't lost on her. David talking about working hard while she faced eviction. The kids need stability. They need to see their father succeed. Linda's dad mentioned something interesting yesterday, actually. There's this old quarry up in the hills which has been abandoned for decades. The owner died, no heirs, county's looking to auction it off cheaply. Could be a good investment flip.
If you're enjoying Sarah's incredible journey from desperation to hope, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us share these inspiring stories with more people who need to hear them. She opened her laptop and found herself typing before she'd made a conscious decision. County Land Auction. The search results were populated with official-looking documents and legal jargon that made her head swim. But there it was, buried in the third page of results. Hillcrest Quarry, 47 acres, minimum bid $800. The photographs showed a scar in the earth, a wound carved into red rock and filled with decades of rainwater. The description was clinical. Inactive limestone quarry, last operated 1987, environmentally cleared, no known mineral value, suitable for recreational or agricultural use. It looked like the end of the world, like the place where dreams went to die. But something in her chest stirred. Not hope, exactly, but something adjacent to it. A crazy, desperate whisper that maybe, just maybe, this was the answer. Not because it made sense, but because nothing else did anymore. Because sometimes when you're drowning, you grab onto anything that floats, even if it looks like it might drag you under. "Mama, what are you looking at?" Emma climbed onto her lap, her small fingers tracing the quarry's edge on the screen. "Just something silly, baby. A big hole in the ground." "It looks like a lake," Emma said, tilting her head. "Like where princesses might live." Marcus peered over Sarah's shoulder, his practical 10-year-old mind already working. "How much does it cost?" "More than we have," Sarah said automatically. But the words felt strange in her mouth, because they didn't, actually. She had $1,000, more than the minimum bid. It was insane, impossible, the kind of decision that people would shake their heads about for years to come. But it was also the only choice that didn't end with them on the street. What would they say if she bought a dead quarry with her last $1,000? What would David say? What would everyone say when single mother Sarah Martinez, the cautionary tale, the example of what happened when you made poor choices, threw her final safety net into a hole in the ground? The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with something she hadn't felt in months, the electric thrill of possibility. Because at the bottom of that hole, reflected in rainwater and shadow, she saw something no one else could see. Not treasure, not marble, not anything rational. She saw a chance. She saw a choice that was entirely her own. She picked up her phone and dialed the county office, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "County Land Management, this is Rebecca." "Hi, I'm calling about the Hillcrest Quarry auction. I'd like to place a bid." "Ma'am, the auction isn't until next Friday. You'll need to register in person and provide proof of funds." "I understand. What's the earliest I can come in?" "We open at 8 tomorrow morning." Sarah looked at her children, at Emma's trusting face and Marcus's worried eyes. She thought about David and Linda, and the anniversary party where her children would be displayed like well-dressed proof of their father's respectability. "I'll be there at 8. And she hung up before she could change her mind. Outside, the February rain kept falling, washing the world clean or drowning it entirely. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. The county office smelled like burnt coffee and bureaucratic despair, fluorescent lights humming overhead like mechanical insects. Sarah sat in the hard plastic chair, her palms sweating as she gripped the cashier's check for $1,000, every penny she had left in the world, converted into a single piece of paper that felt both weightless and impossibly heavy. Rebecca, the clerk who had answered her call yesterday, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked at Sarah with the particular gentleness reserved for people making obviously terrible decisions. "You're sure about this, honey?" Rebecca asked, sliding the registration forms across the counter. "That quarry's been sitting empty for 37 years. There's a reason nobody's wanted it." Sarah's pen hovered over the signature line. Through the office window, she could see her beat-up Honda Civic in the parking lot, duct tape holding the passenger mirror in place, the check engine light that had been glowing for 6 months like a dashboard constellation of failure. This morning, she'd had to choose between gas money and Emma's asthma inhaler. She'd chosen gas, promising herself she'd figure out the medication later, somehow. Sometimes the things nobody wants are exactly what you need. Sarah said, signing her name with a flourish that felt braver than she felt inside. The auction was set for Friday at noon, 5 days to second-guess herself, 5 days for everyone to tell her she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But as Sarah walked back to her car, registration papers in hand, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The strange lightness that comes from having nothing left to lose. Her phone rang as she started the engine. Margaret Martinez, her former mother-in-law, the woman who'd never missed an opportunity to remind Sarah that she'd never been good enough for the Martinez family name. "Sarah, David told me the most ridiculous story. Please tell me you're not actually planning to waste money on some godforsaken hole in the ground." Sarah closed her eyes, summoning patience from reserves she didn't know she still had. "Hello, Margaret. How are you?" "Don't deflect, dear. We need to talk. Come to the house for lunch. Bring the children. It's time someone talked sense into you before you destroy what little stability those poor babies have left." Sarah had dreamed of living in a house like this, back when she was 22 and stupid enough to believe that marrying into a family meant they'd actually accept you as family. Margaret opened the door before Sarah could knock, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, her disapproval radiating like heat from an oven. Behind her stood Carmen, David's sister, a real estate agent who inherited their father's business sense and their mother's talent for cutting remarks. "Sarah," Carmen said, air-kissing her cheek with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a particularly unpleasant relative at a funeral, "you look tired." Emma and Marcus disappeared into the familiar chaos of their cousins, voices echoing from the playroom where toys were plentiful and nobody had to share everything. Sarah watched them go with a pang. This house represented the childhood she couldn't give them, the security that danced just beyond her reach like a mirage in the desert. "Sit," Margaret commanded, gesturing toward the dining room table that had been set for 4. The good china, the cloth napkins, the subtle power play of hospitality wielded like a weapon. "I made your favorite." The favorite in question was chicken enchiladas, a recipe Sarah had taught Margaret years ago during the brief period when she'd thought they might actually become friends. Now it felt like mockery, her own creation served back to her as evidence of better times. "So," Carmen said, cutting into her food with surgical precision, "David says you're planning to buy a quarry. With what money?" "It's an investment," Sarah said, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "Real estate. You should understand that, Carmen." Carmen laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Real estate requires research, market analysis, due diligence. What you're describing is gambling with your children's future." "My children's future is exactly what I'm thinking about. We're getting evicted in 3 weeks. I don't have the luxury of safe choices." Margaret set down her fork with the deliberate care of someone preparing for battle. "Sarah, dear, I know things have been difficult since the divorce. No one's denying that. But this quarry nonsense, it's desperation talking, not wisdom. What you need is stability, structure. Maybe it's time to consider what's best for Emma and Marcus." The words hung in the air like smoke, their implications clear. Sarah's hands stilled on her napkin, her heart rate picking up as the conversation shifted from concern to threat. "What exactly are you suggesting, Margaret?" "I'm suggesting that 2 growing children need more than their mother's good intentions. They need opportunities, education, a stable home environment." Margaret's voice was gentle, reasonable, the tone of someone delivering bad news for your own good. "Carmen and Robert have that big house, excellent schools in their district. The boys would love having their cousins around." Sarah looked at Carmen, who had the grace to appear slightly uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to object. The offer, if it could be called that, was perfectly reasonable from their perspective. Take the kids, provide stability, let Sarah figure out her life without dragging 2 innocent children through her poor decisions. "You want to take my children?" "We want to help your children," Carmen corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there? Because it sounds like you're saying I'm an unfit mother." "You're a loving mother," Margaret said carefully, "but love isn't always enough. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is admit when they need help." The worst part was that it made sense.
Sarah looked around the dining room with its family photos and expensive frames, at the evidence of birthday parties and piano lessons and summer camps that she could never provide. She thought about Emma's inhaler sitting on the pharmacy counter, about Marcus doing homework by candlelight because the electricity had been shut off again. But she also thought about Emma's laugh when they made shadow puppets on the wall during their last blackout, about Marcus's fierce hug when he'd overheard her crying and whispered that he'd take care of her forever. She thought about the way they curled up together on the couch for movie nights, sharing popcorn and dreams, creating their own version of family that might be broken but was undeniably theirs. "No," Sarah said, the word emerging with surprising strength. "No. I won't give up my children because you think I'm not good enough for them." "Sarah," Margaret began. "I said no." Sarah stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Emma, Marcus, we're leaving." "You're making a mistake," Carmen called after her as the children appeared, confused by the sudden departure. "That quarry is going to bankrupt you. Then what? Then where will you be?" Sarah paused in the doorway, her children flanking her like small soldiers. "I'll be exactly where I am now, fighting for my family. The difference is, I'll be doing it on my own terms." The drive home passed in silence, Emma and Marcus sensing the tension without understanding its source. Back in their apartment, Sarah sat on the couch and pulled them close, breathing in their familiar scent, feeling the weight of the decision she'd just made. She turned down safety, security, everything that made logical sense for the slim chance that a hole in the ground might somehow save them. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom told me what happened. You're being selfish. Think about what's best for the kids for once." She deleted the message without responding and opened her laptop instead. The Quarry photos stared back at her, that gaping wound in the earth that had somehow become her last hope. She read the Geological survey again, the environmental reports, the county assessments that all came to the same conclusion: worthless rock, standing water, no commercial value. But late that night, after the children were asleep, Sarah found herself driving through the winding roads that led up into the hills. The Quarry sat behind a chain-link fence, a "no trespassing" sign hanging crooked like a broken tooth. She parked on the shoulder and walked to the fence, her fingers curling through the cold metal links. In the moonlight, the Quarry looked different than in the photographs, mysterious rather than desolate. The water at the bottom reflected the stars like a mirror, and the carved rock walls caught shadows that seemed to dance in the wind. It wasn't beautiful exactly, but it was hers, or would be, in 3 days when the auction closed. "What am I doing?" she whispered to the night air, and the Quarry seemed to whisper back. "Everything." A car door slammed behind her, footsteps crunching on gravel. Sarah turned to find a man in his 60s approaching, wearing a worn Carhartt jacket and carrying a flashlight. "You must be the one buying old Hillcrest," he said, not unkindly. "I'm Joe Brennan, live just down the road." "Sarah Martinez, and I haven't bought anything yet." Joe laughed, a sound that carried warmth in the cold night air. "Honey, the whole county's been talking about the woman crazy enough to bid on this place. Takes guts, I'll give you that. Or stupidity. Sometimes they're the same thing." Joe aimed his flashlight into the quarry, the beam catching the water's surface. "My grandfather worked this quarry back in the 50s. Good limestone, clean extraction. Made decent money until the big operations moved in, undercut the prices." Sarah found herself leaning forward. What happened to it? Owner's son had no interest in the family business, sold the equipment, let the permits lapse, been sitting here ever since, waiting for someone to see what everyone else missed. Joe clicked off the flashlight and looked at her with eyes that held decades of mountain wisdom. "Question is, what do you see when you look at this place?" Sarah stared into the darkness, trying to articulate the feeling that had been growing in her chest since she'd first seen the photographs. "I see possibilities," she said finally. "I see something that nobody else wants, which means nobody else can tell me what to do with it." Joe nodded slowly. "That's a good start, but possibility ain't the same as a plan. What you gonna do with 47 acres of carved-up rock? It was a fair question, one that Sarah had been avoiding since she'd made the decision to bid. I don't know yet, but I know what I won't do. I won't let my in-laws convince me I'm not capable of providing for my children. I won't let my ex-husband turn me into another cautionary tale, and I won't give up the only thing I have left that's mine. Your land, your choice, Joe said simply. But if you're serious about this, you might want to talk to Pete Morrison over at the university, Geology department. He's been sniffing around these hills for years, taking rock samples, asking questions. Might have some insights worth hearing. As Joe walked back to his truck, Sarah remained at the fence, staring into her future. In 2 days, she would bid on this quarry with money she couldn't afford to lose. She would become the owner of something everyone considered worthless. She would prove Margaret and Carmen and David right about her poor judgment, or she would prove them wrong in ways they couldn't imagine. Either way, she would do it on her own terms, with her children by her side, fighting for a future that belonged to them and no one else. The stars reflected in the quarry water seemed to pulse with their own light, and Sarah chose to take it as a sign. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp February clarity that made everything look sharper, more defined, as if the universe had adjusted its focus for the day that would change everything. Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, applying the last of her lipstick, a tube of drugstore red that had been a splurge 3 months ago when she still believed in small luxuries. Today, it felt like war paint. Emma sat on the closed toilet seat, swinging her legs and watching her mother's ritual with the intense fascination that children reserve for moments they sense are important without understanding why. "Mama, why are you wearing your fancy lipstick? Are we going somewhere special?" Sarah capped the tube and turned to face her daughter, this 7-year-old person who trusted her with the kind of absolute faith that was humbling and terrifying. "We're going to buy a piece of land today, baby. A big hole in the ground that nobody else wants." "The Princess Lake?" Emma's eyes lit up with the particular magic that children brought to even the most mundane situations. "The Princess Lake," Sarah confirmed, though the comparison felt both ridiculous and perfectly accurate. She was about to spend her last $1,000 on a fairy tale, after all. Marcus appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his cleanest jeans and the button-down shirt she'd found at Goodwill last month. At 10, he understood the gravity of their situation in ways that sometimes kept Sarah awake at night, wondering if she'd robbed him of his childhood by making him his confidant in their financial struggles. "Mom, I've been thinking about the quarry," he said, his voice carrying that careful weight he'd developed when discussing family finances. "If it doesn't work out, we could maybe live in the car for a while. I looked it up online." Some families do that. Sarah's heart cracked a little more, the way it did every time her children displayed the resilience they'd been forced to develop. She knelt down and pulled them both close, breathing in their morning scent of toothpaste and hope. "We're not going to live in the car, baby, and the quarry is going to work out. I can feel it." The words came out with more confidence than she felt, but sometimes being a mother meant projecting certainty when everything inside you was chaos and doubt. Sometimes it meant believing in impossible things because your children needed you to believe.
The county courthouse buzzed with the particular energy of auction day, the mixture of opportunism and desperation that made Sarah's skin crawl. She'd arrived early, wanting to observe the other bidders, to understand what she was up against. The main auction hall was filled with men in expensive suits and women with designer handbags, the kind of people who bought land the way others bought groceries, casually, confidently, with the comfortable knowledge that if one investment didn't pan out, there would always be another. Sarah found a seat in the back, her children flanking her like small bodyguards. Emma had brought her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Whiskers, and Marcus clutched a notebook where he'd been writing down numbers and calculations that she didn't have the heart to tell him were probably meaningless. "Lot number 17, the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing through the hall with professional cheerfulness. "Hillcrest Quarry, 47 acres, limestone excavation site, environmentally cleared. Minimum bid,
$800. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, the kind of dismissive chuckle that people made when confronted with something they considered beneath their notice. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she raised her numbered paddle anyway. $800 from bidder 47. For a moment, the hall was silent. Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her, taking in her thrift store clothing and her nervous children, making rapid calculations about what kind of person would bid on abandoned industrial waste. Then a voice from the front row called out, smooth and confident, $1,000. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound, her heart sinking as she recognized the speaker, Robert Santos, Carmen's husband, a real estate developer who specialized in buying distressed properties and flipping them for massive profits. He turned in his seat and caught her eye, offering a smile that was equal parts pity and triumph. $1,100, Sarah called out, her voice stronger than she felt. $1,500, Robert replied without hesitation. The numbers climbed steadily, each bid feeling like a physical blow. $1,600, $1,800, $2,000. Sarah watched her last hope slip away with each raise of Robert's hand, each casual increase that represented more money than she could imagine having. $2,500, Robert called out, and this time he didn't even bother to look back at her. The message was clear. This was over, and they both knew it.
Sarah stared at her paddle, at the number 47 that had felt so lucky this morning and now seemed to mock her naivety. She had exactly $1,043 to her name. She was outgunned, outclassed, and outspent by people who bought quarries for sport. $2,500 going once, the auctioneer announced. Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. Mama, why aren't you raising your hand anymore? The question cut through Sarah's despair like a knife. Because I don't have enough money, she wanted to say. Because your father's family is determined to prove that I'm a failure. Because sometimes the good guys don't win, and sometimes believing in impossible things just leaves you more broken than before. But looking into Emma's trusting face, Sarah found herself thinking about something else entirely. She thought about her grandmother, Elena, who had crossed the border from Mexico with nothing but the clothes on her back and the fierce determination to build something better for her children. Elena, who had cleaned houses and worked double shifts and saved every penny until she could buy a tiny plot of land in East LA where she grew vegetables and raised chickens and proved that sometimes the impossible was just another word for difficult. Because sometimes you have to bet everything on yourself, Sarah said, and raised her paddle one more time. $3,000. The words rang out across the hall like a gunshot, followed by a silence so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. She didn't have $3,000. She didn't have $2,000. What she had was the certainty that if she didn't fight for this, if she didn't risk everything on the slimmest chance of changing their lives, she would spend the rest of her days wondering what might have been. Robert turned around slowly, his expression shifting from amusement to surprise to something that looked almost like respect. $4,500, he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Sarah's mind raced. She could put the house deposit on her credit card, maybe find a way to make minimum payments until what? Until a miracle happened? Until the quarry somehow generated income? Until her children forgave her for gambling their future on a hole in the ground? $5,000, she called out, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even the auctioneer looked surprised, glancing between the two bidders with the expression of someone witnessing an unexpected drama unfold. Robert stood up, straightening his expensive suit jacket with deliberate care. He walked back to where Sarah sat, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet hall. When he reached her row, he leaned down and spoke in a voice just loud enough for her to hear. "Sarah, you're embarrassing yourself. You don't have $5,000. We both know that. Do we?" Maybe you don't know me as well as you think you do. This isn't a game. This is real money, real consequences. What happens when you can't pay? What happens to Emma and Marcus when you're drowning in debt you can't handle? The questions hit their target, each one a perfectly aimed arrow designed to find her deepest fears. But Sarah had learned something in the past week, something that Margaret and Carmen and David had never understood. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was play it safe. Sometimes safety was just another word for giving up. What happens to them if I don't try? What happens if I teach them that when things get hard, you just accept whatever scraps other people are willing to give you? Robert studied her face for a long moment, then shook his head and returned to his seat. 6,000, he called out, but something in his voice had changed. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about Elena's garden, about the way her grandmother's hands had looked in the soil, weathered and strong, and absolutely certain that anything could grow if you cared for it properly. She thought about Emma calling the quarry a princess lake, about Marcus's notebook full of careful calculations, about the way Joe Brennan had talked about possibility and plans.
$7,000, she said. And this time she stood up as she said it, her voice carrying across the hall with the kind of authority that comes from having nothing left to lose. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Robert remained seated, his hands still, his expression unreadable. The auctioneer looked between them expectantly. 7,000? Going once? Going twice. 8,000. The voice came from the back of the hall, crisp and unexpected. Sarah turned to see a woman in her 50s walking down the center aisle, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her clothing expensive but understated. She moved with a kind of confidence that came from old money, the sort of person who bought land because her great-grandfather had bought land, because that's what families like hers did. "I'm sorry," the woman said, addressing Sarah directly as she approached. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Victoria Ashford. My family has some holdings in this area." Sarah's heart sank to somewhere around her knees. Victoria Ashford. She knew the name from newspaper society pages, from charity galas and museum fundraisers, from the kind of old money networks that turned land acquisition into a casual hobby. "Sarah Martinez," she managed, her voice sounding small and defeated. "Miss Martinez, I've been watching this auction with great interest. Tell me, what do you plan to do with the quarry if you're successful?" The question felt like a trap, but Sarah found herself answering honestly. "I don't know yet. I just know that my children and I need something that's ours, something that nobody can take away from us." Victoria nodded slowly, as if this was the answer she'd expected. "And you're prepared to bid $8,000 for that certainty?" "I'm prepared to bid whatever it takes." "Even if you don't have whatever it takes?" Sarah lifted her chin, channeling every ounce of Elena's stubborn pride, especially then. Victoria smiled, an expression that transformed her austere features into something almost maternal. "Mr. Santos," she called, turning toward Robert, "I believe you're familiar with my family's development projects in this county." Robert's face had gone pale. "Of course, Mrs. Ashford. We've always had great respect for Ashford Enterprises." "Good. Then you'll understand when I tell you that my family has decided to support Miss Martinez's bid for this property. We believe it represents exactly the kind of individual initiative that this community needs more of." The hall erupted in whispers, heads turning and conversations buzzing as the social dynamics shifted with tectonic force. Robert looked like a man who just realized he was playing chess against a grandmaster while armed with checkers pieces. 8,500, Victoria called out cheerfully. Robert remained seated, his hands folded, his expression carefully neutral. He'd been outmaneuvered by forces far beyond Sarah's financial situation, caught in the cross-currents of county politics and old money influence that she was only beginning to understand. 8,500? Going once? Going twice? Sold to bidder 47, Sarah Martinez. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, like the closing of one door and the violent opening of another. What happens next will absolutely blow your mind. But before we continue with Sarah's unbelievable discovery, if this story is inspiring you to take risks in your own life, please hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear that impossible dreams can come true. Sarah sat in stunned silence as the hall erupted around her, conversations resuming and people filing out to examine the next lot. Emma squeezed her hand and Marcus leaned against her shoulder, and she realized that somehow, impossibly, she had just bought a quarry. Victoria appeared at her elbow, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating complex social situations. "Congratulations, Ms. Martinez. I believe you've just made a very interesting investment." "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help me?" "Because sometimes the people who need something the most are the ones most likely to find its true value." Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out an elegant business card. "My family has a long history in this county, Ms. Martinez. We've learned that the most successful investments aren't always the most obvious ones. I suspect you're about to prove that principle in ways that will surprise everyone, including yourself." As Victoria walked away, Sarah stared at the business card in her hands. Ashford Enterprises, with a phone number and an address in the kind of part of town where people like her weren't usually welcome. But tucked behind the card was something else, a handwritten note that made her breath catch in her throat. "Call Professor Pete Morrison at the University Geology Department. Tell him Victoria sent you. Some stones are worth more than others. V.A." Sarah looked around the emptying hall, at Robert Santos gathering his papers with the careful dignity of someone who'd just been publicly humiliated, at her children waiting patiently for her to explain what had just happened, at the official documents that would make her the owner of 47 acres of supposedly worthless land. She thought about Elena's garden again, about the way her grandmother had always insisted that the best treasures were the ones that other people overlooked, about patience and persistence, and the strange magic that happened when you planted seeds in unlikely soil. "Mama," Emma said, tugging on her jacket, "do we own the Princess Lake now?" Sarah folded Victoria's note carefully and slipped it into her purse, right next to the eviction notice that had started this whole impossible journey. "Yes, baby, we own the Princess Lake." But as they walked out of the courthouse into the bright February afternoon, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the lake, and whatever secrets it might be hiding, might actually own them. The papers would take a week to process. In 7 days, she would officially become the owner of the Hillcrest Quarry, and everyone who'd ever doubted her would get to watch what happened when a desperate woman with nothing to lose decided to bet everything on a hole in the ground. She just hoped she'd live long enough to find out if the bet would pay off. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Sarah had signed the final papers making her the official owner of 47 acres of what everyone still considered worthless land. She was standing in her kitchen, stirring powdered milk into Alana's cereal because they'd run out of the real thing again, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Martinez, this is Professor Pete Morrison from the University Geology Department. I believe Victoria Ashford suggested you might give me a call." Sarah's heart skipped. She'd been carrying Victoria's note in her wallet like a talisman, but hadn't found the courage to make the call. What did she know about geology? What did she know about anything beyond keeping her children fed and housed from one day to the next? "Professor Morrison, yes, Victoria mentioned you might have some insights about my property." "The Hillcrest Quarry, yes. I've been fascinated by that site for years. Would it be possible for me to take a look at it? I'm particularly interested in the geological formations in that area." Something in his voice, an excitement barely contained beneath academic politeness, made Sarah's pulse quicken. "What kind of formations?" "Well, that's what I'd like to determine. Would this afternoon work for you? I could meet you at the site around 2 o'clock. Sarah looked around her apartment, at the eviction notice that had been extended but not eliminated, at the pile of bills that grew like a malignant tumor on her kitchen counter. She had nothing to lose by saying yes, and maybe, just maybe, something to gain. I'll see you there at 2. Professor Pete Morrison turned out to be a man in his early 60s with wild gray hair and the kind of intense enthusiasm that made him seem decades younger. He stood at the quarry's edge like a child on Christmas morning, holding what looked like a metal detector crossed with a computer, scanning the exposed rock faces with the concentration of a surgeon. "Magnificent," he murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. "Absolutely magnificent." Emma and Marcus had insisted on coming along, treating the professor's visit like an adventure. Emma was collecting special rocks in her jacket pockets, while Marcus peppered Pete with questions about how old the quarry was and why someone would dig such a big hole in the first place. The limestone operation here stopped in 1987, but what they were extracting was just the surface layer. The really interesting geology is what they never touched. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, as she watched him work his way along the quarry wall with methodical precision. Pete stopped, suddenly, his machine emitting a series of rapid beeps that made him grin like he'd just won the lottery. "Miss Martinez, do you see this section here? This vein of white rock running through the limestone?" Sarah followed his pointing finger to what looked like a thick stripe of pale stone cutting through the darker rock face. To her untrained eye, it didn't look particularly special, just another layer in the geological story written on the quarry walls. "My grandfather always called it the angel's backbone," she heard Joe Brennan's voice say behind them. They turned to find the old man approaching with a thermos of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for decades. "Mr. Brennan, I was hoping I'd run into you. Your grandfather worked this quarry in the 50s, didn't he?" 53 to 58, until the owner got scared of the expense and shut down the deep excavation. "My granddad used to say there was a fortune hiding down there, but the surface limestone was easier money. Nobody wanted to invest in going deeper."
Pete's equipment was beeping frantically now, a sound that seemed to echo off the quarry walls like mechanical birdsong. "Ms. Martinez, what I'm detecting here is not limestone. The mineral composition, the density readings, this appears to be marble, high-quality marble." The word hung in the air like something from a foreign language. Sarah had heard of marble, of course, expensive kitchen countertops and ancient Greek statues, but it seemed as distant from her life as space travel or hot cuisine. "What does that mean?" she asked. Pete looked at her with the expression of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. "It means, Miss Martinez, that you may have just purchased one of the largest untapped marble deposits in the state." The words didn't register at first. Sarah heard them, understood them individually, but strung together they seemed to describe someone else's life, someone else's impossible luck. She was the woman who couldn't afford her daughter's asthma medication, not the woman who stumbled onto geological treasure. "I don't understand," she said finally. "The county reports, the geological surveys, they all said there was no mineral value." "Surface surveys," Joe said with a knowing smile. "Nobody ever bothered to look at what was underneath the limestone cap. Cost too much, took too long, and the limestone business was good enough for most folks." Pete was practically vibrating with excitement now, taking photographs and making notes in a battered field journal. "The vein structure suggests this deposit could run for miles underground. The quality appears exceptional. This is Carrara-grade material we're looking at." "Carrara?" "Italian marble, the finest in the world. Michelangelo used Carrara marble for the David, for the Pietà. Modern Carrara marble sells for anywhere from $200 to $800 per cubic foot, depending on the grade and rarity." Sarah's knees felt suddenly weak. She sat down hard on a chunk of limestone, her mind struggling to process numbers that seemed to belong in someone else's reality. "How much marble are we talking about?" Pete consulted his readings, making rapid calculations in his notebook.
Based on the geological indicators and the vein structure, I'd estimate you're looking at potentially millions of cubic feet. The deposit appears to extend far beyond the current quarry boundaries. Millions? Sarah repeated, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. Miss Martinez, I think you need to understand what we're looking at here. If my preliminary assessment is correct, and I'll need to bring in a full geological team to confirm this, you may have just become the owner of a marble deposit worth somewhere in the range of $160 million. The number was so large that my brain simply refused to process it. $160 million. It was the kind of money that existed in movies and lottery fantasies, not in the life of a woman who'd bought this land with her last $1,000 because she was desperate and out of options.
Emma appeared at her elbow, tugging on her jacket with the impatience of a 7-year-old who'd been ignored for too long. "Mama, Mr. Pete says we have treasure in our Princess Lake. Is that true?" Sarah looked down at her daughter's expectant face, at Marcus hovering nearby with his notebook full of careful calculations, at the quarry that she'd bought as a last resort and that might somehow be their salvation. "I think so, baby," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we might have treasure." The next 3 days passed in a blur of phone calls and visitors and possibilities that seemed too good to be true. Pete returned with a full geological survey team, their equipment turning the quiet quarry into something resembling a scientific expedition. Sarah watched from the sidelines as they took core samples and ran tests and spoke in technical language that might as well have been ancient Greek. Victoria Ashford appeared on Thursday afternoon, emerging from a sleek black sedan like a fairy godmother dressed in Armani. She surveyed the activity with the satisfied expression of someone whose hunches had proven correct. "Miss Martinez," she said, joining Sarah at the quarry's edge where she'd been watching the geologist work. "I trust Professor Morrison's findings have been illuminating." "They're saying it's worth over $100 million, Sarah said, the words still feeling unreal. "I don't understand how this is possible. How did you know?" Victoria smiled, an expression that held layers of meaning Sarah was only beginning to understand. "My family has been in this county for 4 generations, my dear. We've learned to pay attention to things that others overlook. My great-grandfather kept extensive geological records, maps and surveys that most people forgot existed. The Hillcrest area has always been interesting." "You knew there was marble here?" "I suspected, but suspicion and proof are very different things." Victoria gestured toward the activity below them where Pete's team was carefully extracting core samples from the quarry wall. "Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is give someone else the opportunity to discover their own good fortune." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February air. Why me? Why help me instead of buying the property yourself? "Because, my dear, my family already has more money than we know what to do with. But you needed this. You were willing to risk everything for the possibility of something better. That kind of courage deserves to be rewarded." Before Sarah could respond, Pete Morrison was climbing up from the quarry floor, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Miss Martinez, the preliminary results are even better than I hoped. The marble quality is exceptional, and the deposit extends well beyond what we initially thought. We're looking at one of the purest veins of Carrara-quality marble ever discovered in North America." "What does that mean, practically speaking?" Victoria asked, with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to translating scientific enthusiasm into business terms. "It means," Pete said, consulting his tablet with barely contained glee, "that Miss Martinez is sitting on approximately $163 million worth of premium marble." The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd heard it before, but somehow having it confirmed, made official by scientific testing and professional assessment, made it real in a way that left her breathless. $163 million, she repeated. "Give or take a few million, depending on market fluctuations and extraction cost," Pete confirmed cheerfully. Sarah sat down hard on the ground, her legs no longer willing to support her weight. 3 weeks ago, she'd been facing eviction with her last $1,000. Today, she was apparently one of the wealthiest women in the state. The transformation was so complete, so impossible, that she half expected to wake up in her apartment with Emma shaking her shoulder and asking for breakfast.
"Mama, are you okay?" Marcus appeared beside her, his young face creased with worry. At 10, he'd become an expert at reading the signs of his mother's distress, and her current expression probably looked like shock verging on a medical emergency. "I'm okay, baby. I'm just surprised." "Good surprise or bad surprise?" Sarah looked at her son, this serious little boy who'd grown up too fast, who'd learned to worry about electricity bills and grocery money and whether they'd have a place to sleep next month.
"Good surprise," she said, pulling him close. "Very, very good surprise." Emma bounced over, her pockets bulging with rocks she'd collected from the quarry floor. "Are we rich now, Mama? Can we buy ice cream whenever we want?" The question was so perfectly 7-year-old, so innocently practical, that Sarah found herself laughing for the first time in months. "Yes, baby, we can buy ice cream whenever we want." "And new shoes? And books? And can Marcus get those art supplies he's been wanting?" "All of that and more." Emma's whoop of joy echoed off the quarry walls, and for a moment, the geological surveys and million-dollar assessments faded into background noise. What mattered was the sound of her daughter's laughter, the way Marcus's worried expression finally relaxed into something approaching wonder. But as the afternoon wore on and the geological team packed up their equipment, Sarah found herself thinking about the other calls she would need to make. David would have to be told, of course, and Margaret and Carmen, who'd spent weeks telling everyone who would listen about poor Sarah's terrible judgment and desperate decisions. "Ms. Martinez," Victoria said as they prepared to leave, "I imagine the next few weeks are going to be quite eventful for you. Might I suggest you retain a good attorney, and perhaps an accountant who specializes in mineral rights? The transition from quarry owner to mining operation will require some navigation." Sarah nodded, though the practical realities felt as overwhelming as the financial ones. She was a single mother with a high school education who'd been living paycheck to paycheck 3 weeks ago. What did she know about mining operations or mineral rights or the kind of wealth that changed everything? "I don't know how to be rich," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Victoria's expression softened with something that looked almost maternal. "Very few people do initially, but you know how to be brave, and you know how to fight for your children. Those skills will serve you well in any financial situation." As the various cars pulled away and the quarry returned to its usual quiet, Sarah stood at the edge with her children, looking down at the water that reflected the late afternoon sky like a mirror. Somewhere beneath that surface, locked in stone that had been waiting for millions of years, lay a fortune that would change everything. "The Princess Lake really was magical," Emma said softly, slipping her small hand into Sarah's. "Yes," Sarah agreed, squeezing her daughter's fingers. "I think it was." But as they walked back to their beat-up Honda Civic, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the real magic hadn't been in the marble deposit. It had been in the moment 3 weeks ago when she'd decided to risk everything on an impossible hope, when she'd chosen to bet on herself despite everyone telling her she was making a mistake. The marble was a gift, an incredible stroke of luck that would secure her children's future in ways she'd never dared to dream. But the courage to make that first impossible bid, that had come from somewhere else entirely. That had come from the part of her that was Elena's granddaughter, the part that knew how to plant seeds in unlikely soil and wait for miracles to grow. Tomorrow, she would call David and listen to his shock turn to anger, turn to desperate attempts to reconcile. She would hear Margaret's stunned silence and Carmen's barely concealed fury. She would begin the complex process of transforming a quarry into a mining operation, of learning to navigate a world where people would want things from her instead of dismissing her. But tonight, she would take her children out for ice cream, real ice cream, not the generic brand they'd been buying for months, and listen to Emma's plans for their newfound wealth and Marcus's careful questions about college funds and savings accounts. Tonight, she would begin to understand what it meant to be the woman who'd bet her last $1,000 on a hole in the ground and won. The news broke on a Thursday morning, splashed across the local newspaper with the kind of sensational headline that made people spill their coffee. Single mother strikes it rich. $160 million marble discovery transformed abandoned quarry. Sarah stared at her own photograph on the front page, a picture taken without her knowledge at the quarry site, showing her standing with Emma and Marcus beside the geological survey equipment. The caption read, "Sarah Martinez, 32, purchased the worthless Hillcrest Quarry for $8,500 in a county auction. Geological surveys now estimate the marble deposit's value at over $160 million. Her phone had been ringing non-stop since 6 in the morning. Reporters, investment firms, distant relatives she hadn't heard from in years, and mining companies that suddenly found her very interesting indeed. Sarah had stopped answering after the 5th call from someone claiming to be her long-lost cousin with a can't-miss business opportunity. Emma sat at the kitchen table, carefully cutting out the newspaper article with safety scissors, her tongue poking out in concentration. "We're famous, Mama! Can I take this to school for show and tell?" "I don't think that's a good idea, baby," Sarah said, though she couldn't quite explain why the idea of her 7-year-old announcing their newfound wealth to a classroom full of children made her profoundly uncomfortable. Marcus looked up from his cereal, that worried expression back on his face. "Are people going to treat us differently now?" The question cut straight to the heart of Sarah's growing anxiety. In the 2 weeks since the geological confirmation, she'd begun to understand that money, real money, life-changing money, brought complications she'd never considered. Victoria Ashford had introduced her to a lawyer, a sharp woman named Janet Walsh, who'd explained mineral rights and extraction contracts and tax implications with the patient efficiency of someone who'd guided many newly wealthy clients through their first crisis of fortune. "Some people might," Sarah said honestly, "but the people who really matter will still see us as the same family we've always been." The doorbell rang, followed immediately by an aggressive knock that made all 3 of them jump. Through the window, Sarah could see David's BMW parked in their driveway, gleaming silver against the modest apartment complex's cracked asphalt. "Stay here," she told the children, though Emma was already peering around the corner with the unabashed curiosity of someone who sensed drama approaching. David stood on her doorstep looking like a man who'd been personally insulted by the universe. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, and his expression carried the particular fury of someone who just realized they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Sarah." His voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "We need to talk." "Good morning to you, too, David." Sarah stepped outside and closed the door behind her, unwilling to let his anger contaminate the space where her children felt safe. "What can I do for you?" "What can you do for me?" David's laugh came out harsh and bitter. "You can start by explaining how you managed to stumble into $160 million while I'm struggling to make rent on my apartment." The complaint was so absurd, so perfectly David, that Sarah almost smiled. Even faced with her impossible success, he managed to make it about his own disappointment. "I bought a quarry. I told you it was a stupid investment, remember?" "I told you it was stupid because it was stupid. Nobody could have predicted this. It's not like you're some kind of geological genius who saw something everyone else missed. You got lucky, Sarah. Incredibly, impossibly lucky." "You're right," Sarah agreed, and watched David's momentum falter as he'd prepared for an argument, not agreement. "I did get lucky, but luck only matters if you're brave enough to take the risk in the first place." David stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. In the 8 years they'd been married, Sarah had never spoken to him with this kind of quiet confidence.
had never met his anger with anything but apology or retreat. "Look," he said, switching tactics with the fluid adaptability of a man accustomed to getting his way through charm when intimidation failed. "I know things ended badly between us. I know I haven't been the best father or ex-husband, but this changes everything, Sarah. We could get back together, give the kids a stable two-parent home. With this kind of money, we could—" "No." The word came out so simply, so definitively that David actually stepped backward. "No?" "No, David. We're not getting back together. You left us when things got hard. You chose Linda and her trust fund over your own children. You can't just waltz back now that I figured out how to build something better. You didn't build anything. You bought a hole in the ground with your grocery money." "I bought hope with my last $1,000, Sarah corrected. "I chose to believe in something when everyone else told me I was crazy. That's exactly the kind of building that matters." Before David could respond, another car pulled into the driveway, Margaret's pristine Lexus, followed closely by Carmen's real estate office vehicle. Sarah watched her former in-laws emerge from their cars with the grim determination of people arriving at a battlefield. "Sarah, dear," Margaret called out, with the kind of forced sweetness that usually preceded a lecture about financial responsibility, "we heard the most extraordinary news. Surely there's been some mistake." Carmen approached with her phone in hand, clearly having been researching marble prices and mining operations during the drive over. "The newspaper says 160 million, but that seems impossible. Real estate values don't just—" "It's not real estate, it's mineral rights. And yes, it's real." The three members of the Martinez family stood on her doorstep looking like they'd been slapped with a fish. Margaret's mouth worked soundlessly for several seconds before she managed to speak. "Well," she said finally, "this certainly changes things, doesn't it? Of course, the children will need proper guidance about managing this kind of wealth, educational trusts, investment strategies, tax planning." "The children will need their mother," Sarah said firmly, "the same mother who's been taking care of them just fine while all of you were busy telling me what a terrible job I was doing." "Now, Sarah," Carmen began, in the patronizing tone she used when explaining obvious things to slow people, "you can't possibly think you're equipped to handle this kind of financial responsibility. You'll need professional help, family support." "I have professional help. Victoria Ashford introduced me to excellent legal and financial advisors. As for family support, I'm still waiting to see what that looks like." The front door opened behind Sarah, and Emma peeked out with the fearless curiosity of a child who'd never learned to be intimidated by adult tensions. "Hi, Daddy. Hi, Grandma Margaret. Did you come to see our treasure?" David knelt down to Emma's level, his expression softening in the way it always did when he focused on his children rather than his own disappointments. "Hey, Princess. Yes, Daddy heard about your mama's amazing discovery. It's not just mama's, it's our family treasure. Mama says we can buy ice cream whenever we want now, and books, and Marcus can get those fancy art supplies."
"That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," Margaret said, but her eyes remained fixed on Sarah with calculating intensity. "And I'm sure your mama will make very wise decisions about how to use this blessing." The word blessing carried enough subtle emphasis to make its meaning clear. This windfall was a gift from God or fortune, not something Sarah had earned through her own choices and courage. "Actually," Sarah said, "I've already made some decisions. I'm setting up college funds for both children, of course, but I'm also planning to use some of the money to help other single mothers in similar situations. There's going to be a foundation, the Elena Martinez Foundation, named after my grandmother." The announcement landed like a small bomb in the middle of the group. David's face flushed with what looked like physical pain. "A foundation? Sarah, you can't just give away money like that. You need to think about security, about building wealth for the family." "I'm thinking about exactly that,"
Sarah replied. "I'm thinking about the kind of family I want my children to grow up in, the kind of values I want them to learn." Elena came to this country with nothing and built something beautiful through hard work and faith. This foundation will help other women do the same thing. Marcus appeared in the doorway beside his sister, drawn by the sound of adult conversation that seemed to revolve around their family's future. Sarah watched him take in the scene, his father's frustrated expression, his grandmother's thinly veiled disapproval, his aunt's calculating stare, and something shifted in his young face. "Mom's really smart," he said suddenly, his voice carrying the kind of fierce loyalty that made Sarah's heart swell. "She bought the Quarry when everyone said it was stupid. She took care of us when Dad left. She always finds a way to make things work." "Of course she does, sweetheart," Margaret said, with the kind of condescending patience that made Sarah want to scream. "But managing this kind of wealth requires experience, education. It requires trusting yourself. It requires being willing to take risks when everyone tells you to play it safe. It requires remembering where you came from and who you're fighting for." She looked at each of them in turn, David with his bewildered entitlement, Margaret with her barely concealed grab for control, Carmen with her real estate agent's instinct to find the angle in every situation. "You've made it clear I wasn't good enough for this family." "Sarah, that's not—" "It is fair," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "And now that I've proven you wrong, now that I've built something incredible from nothing, you want to be part of it. You want to guide my decisions and manage my money and make sure I don't mess up the good fortune you think I don't deserve." Margaret's face had gone pale with indignation. "We're trying to help you, dear. We're trying to protect you from making mistakes." "I've already made my mistakes. I married a man who valued his mother's opinion more than his wife's happiness. I spent years trying to win approval from people who were never going to give it. I let other people's fears convince me that I wasn't capable of extraordinary things." She pulled Emma and Marcus closer, feeling their small bodies warm against her sides like anchors in a storm. "But I chose to fight for my children's future." The silence stretched out like a held breath, filled with years of accumulated resentment and newly shifted power dynamics. Finally, David cleared his throat. "So, what happens now? With us, I mean, with the kids?" Sarah considered the question, looking at this man who'd shared her bed and her dreams and ultimately chosen easier options when life got complicated. "The kids will always be your children, David. But I won't pretend that money changes what happened between us. You left when we needed you most. That's not something a bank account can fix."
"And us?" Margaret asked, her voice smaller than Sarah had ever heard it. "The family?" "You're welcome to be part of our lives," Sarah said carefully, "but not as advisors or managers or people who know better than I do what's good for my children. If you want to be family, you have to actually treat us like family. That means respect. That means trust. That means supporting our decisions even when you don't understand them." Carmen was the first to break, her real estate agent's pragmatism overriding whatever family loyalty she might have felt. "Well," she said with forced brightness, "I suppose congratulations are in order. This is certainly an interesting development." She turned and walked back to her car without another word, her heels clicking against the asphalt like a countdown timer. Margaret followed more slowly, pausing at her car door to look back at Sarah with an expression that was part admiration, part bewilderment. "You've changed," she said finally. "No, I just stopped hiding who I really was." David lingered on the doorstep after his mother and sister had driven away, his hands shoved deep in his pockets like a teenager who'd been caught breaking curfew. "I really screwed this up, didn't I?" he said finally. "Yes," Sarah agreed, not unkindly. "You did. Is there any chance, any possibility that we could—" "David." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "I don't love you anymore. I haven't for a long time. The money doesn't change that.
If anything, it makes it clearer. I don't need you to rescue me because I've learned how to rescue myself." He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of a future that would be very different from what he'd imagined an hour ago. "Can I still see the kids?" "Of course, but they're not going to be your ticket back into a life you walked away from. They're people, David. They deserve a father who wants them for themselves, not for what they might give him access to." After David left, Sarah sat on her front steps with Emma and Marcus flanking her like small sentinels. The morning sun had burned off the February chill, and she could hear the sounds of normal life resuming around them: children playing in distant yards, cars starting, the ordinary rhythms of a world that had kept turning despite her personal earthquake. "Are we going to be okay, Mama?" Marcus asked, and Sarah realized he wasn't talking about money. He was talking about family, about the stability that came from knowing who you could count on when everything else fell apart. "We're going to be better than okay," she said, pulling him close. "We're going to be exactly who we were meant to be." Emma leaned against her other side, still clutching the newspaper clipping like a trophy. "Will you tell us the story again? About how you bought the Princess Lake with our last money?" Sarah smiled, thinking about Elena and her garden, about the seeds that grew in unlikely soil, about the courage it took to plant something when you couldn't see what might bloom. Once upon a time, there was a brave mama who decided to bet everything on hope.
And as she told the story, their story, Sarah realized that the real treasure hadn't been hidden in the marble deposit. It had been there all along, in the love between a mother and her children, in the strength that came from surviving the worst and choosing to keep believing in better. The money would change their circumstances, but it couldn't improve on that foundation. Some fortunes, she understood now, were worth more than any amount of marble hidden in the earth. 5 years later, the Elena Martinez Foundation occupied an entire floor of a downtown office building, its windows looking out over the city where Sarah had once counted pennies and prayed for miracles. She stood in her corner office, watching the morning sun paint the skyline gold, and marveled at how different the view looked when you weren't afraid of falling. "Mom, the photographer's here for the magazine shoot," Marcus called from the doorway. At 15, he'd grown tall and lean, inheriting his grandmother Elena's thoughtful eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. He moved through the foundation offices with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up watching his mother build something meaningful from nothing. "Already?" Sarah glanced at her watch, surprised by how quickly the morning had passed. She'd been reviewing grant applications, 47 single mothers requesting assistance with everything from emergency housing to small business loans. Each application told a story she recognized, each desperate request echoing her own journey from that February morning when she'd held an eviction notice with trembling hands. The magazine was Forbes, and the article was part of their Women Who Changed Everything issue. Sarah still felt slightly ridiculous being included alongside tech entrepreneurs and Fortune 500 CEOs. But Victoria Ashford had insisted that her story deserved the broadest possible platform. Sarah Martinez didn't just strike it rich, Victoria had explained to the reporter during the preliminary interview. She used her fortune to create a systematic solution to the poverty that nearly destroyed her family. She turned personal survival into social transformation. Emma bounced into the office behind her brother, 12 years old now and already showing signs of the fierce independence that seemed to run in their family's DNA. She wore the uniform of a private school, a choice that had sparked heated debates about privilege and accessibility, until Sarah realized her daughter could be an advocate anywhere she went. "The kids from the after-school program made you a card," Emma announced, holding up a construction paper creation covered in glitter and heartfelt messages. "Mrs. Rodriguez says to tell you that 3 more families found permanent housing this month." Sarah accepted the card with the reverence it deserved. The foundation's after-school program had started small, just a safe place for children to go while their mothers worked multiple jobs or attended night classes.
Now it served over 200 kids across 5 locations, providing tutoring, meals, and the kind of stability that Sarah remembered desperately needing during those dark months before the quarry changed everything. The photographer turned out to be a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and the particular efficiency of someone who specialized in capturing authentic moments rather than posed perfection. She set up her equipment while Sarah mentally prepared for the familiar ritual of explaining how a desperate gamble had transformed into purposeful wealth. "I'd like to start with some shots here in your office, but I understand the Quarry site is particularly meaningful to you. It's where everything began. We can drive up there this afternoon if you'd like." The Quarry had been transformed over the past 5 years into something that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who'd first peered through the chain-link fence with her last $1,000 burning a hole in her pocket. The marble extraction operation employed over 100 people, many of them single mothers who'd been hired through the foundation's job training programs. The company, Martinez Mining, with Sarah as majority owner and Victoria Ashford as strategic partner, had become a model for ethical resource extraction, paying above-market wages and maintaining environmental standards that exceeded federal requirements.
"Mrs. Martinez?" A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Maria Santos, a young woman who'd come to the foundation 8 months earlier with 2 toddlers and a story that could have been Sarah's own biography. "I wanted to thank you again. The loan for my catering business, the help with childcare while I got established. I just got my first big contract, a wedding for 200 people." Sarah hugged Maria, remembering her own grandmother's hands covered in flour, the way Elena had fed the neighborhood from her tiny kitchen and called it abundance. "You did the work, Maria. I just helped remove some of the obstacles." "You gave me the chance to bet on myself," Maria replied, and Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came with seeing her own journey reflected in someone else's success. After lunch, they made the drive up to the quarry in Sarah's truck. Not the beat-up Honda Civic that had finally died 3 years earlier, but not the luxury vehicle that her accountant insisted was tax-deductible either. She'd chosen something practical, reliable, the kind of vehicle that could haul supplies for foundation events and still look appropriate in the church parking lot where she'd started volunteering again. The quarry site buzzed with carefully orchestrated activity. The marble extraction operated on a schedule that prioritized environmental protection over maximum profit, with portions of the site rotating through active mining, restoration, and natural recovery periods. Sarah had insisted on this approach, despite her advisor's warnings about reduced efficiency, and the result was an operation that had become a showcase for sustainable resource management. Joe Brennan waited for them at the site entrance, now serving as the operation's community liaison. At 71, he'd embraced his role as the keeper of local history, leading tours and telling stories about the days when his grandfather had worked these same stone faces with hand tools and determination. "Sarah, I brought you something I thought you might want to see." He handed her a piece of marble, polished smooth and about the size of her palm. Carved into its surface was a simple inscription, "For Elena, who planted seeds in unlikely soil." "The stoneworkers did it on their own time," Joe explained. "I wanted to honor your grandmother since the foundation's named for her and all." Sarah ran her fingers over the carved letters, thinking about Elena's garden, about the vegetables that had flourished in soil that everyone said was too poor for growing anything beautiful, about the way her grandmother had believed in abundance even when evidence suggested scarcity was more realistic. The photographer captured them at the quarry's edge, the place where Sarah had stood 5 years ago and chosen to risk everything on an impossible hope. The water below reflected the afternoon sky like a mirror, and Sarah could still see traces of the woman she'd been, desperate, afraid, convinced that she was running out of options.
but she could also see who she'd become. Someone who'd learned that the most valuable deposits weren't always hidden in the ground. Sometimes they were hidden in the courage to act when action seemed foolish, in the willingness to trust yourself when everyone else suggested you were making a mistake. What would you tell someone who's standing where you were 5 years ago? Someone who's desperate, who's facing impossible choices? The photographer asked, adjusting her angle to catch the light on the quarry walls. Sarah considered the question, thinking about the hundreds of women who'd walked through the foundation's doors, carrying stories of eviction notices and empty bank accounts, and ex-husbands who disappeared when life got complicated. I'd tell them that sometimes the thing that looks like a disaster is actually an opportunity wearing a disguise. I'd tell them that other people's opinions about what's possible don't have to become the limits of your imagination. She paused, watching a hawk circle overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the quarry's sun-warmed stone. But mostly, I'd tell them that the bravest thing you can do is bet on yourself when you're the only one who believes the bet might pay off. The interview portion of the photo shoot took place in the foundation's conference room, where Sarah fielded the familiar questions about luck versus planning, about the responsibility that came with sudden wealth, about her advice for other women facing similar challenges. The quarry was luck, I admitted readily, but buying it wasn't. That was a choice, a desperate choice, maybe, but still a conscious decision to risk everything on the possibility that something better was waiting for me if I was brave enough to reach for it.
The reporter, a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in business profiles, leaned forward with interest. Some critics have suggested that your story, while inspiring, isn't replicable, that it depends on a kind of extraordinary luck that most people can't count on. They're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. Most people who spend their last $1,000 on a hole in the ground don't find marble deposits worth hundreds of millions, but that's not really the point of the story. What is the point? Sarah looked out the conference room windows at the city below, at the lives being lived in apartments and offices and schools where people were making their own impossible choices every day. The point is that you don't have to accept the life that other people think you deserve. You don't have to let their fear limit your possibilities. Sometimes the most reasonable thing you can do is something completely unreasonable. She thought about Margaret and Carmen, who'd eventually become awkward but genuine supporters of the foundation's work, serving on advisory committees and contributing their professional skills to help other women navigate the systems that had once seemed designed to keep them down. About David, who'd remarried and moved to another state, but maintained a regular relationship with Emma and Marcus built on actual presence rather than guilt or obligation. The marble made us rich, Sarah continued, but the decision to risk everything on hope, that's what made us free. As the sun set over the city, Sarah found herself back at the quarry with her children, a ritual they'd maintained every Friday evening for the past 5 years. Emma and Marcus had homework and social lives and the 1,000 obligations of teenagers, but they still carved out this time to sit at the edge of their princess lake and talk about everything and nothing. "I've been thinking about college applications," Marcus said, his voice carrying the particular weight that academic planning brought to 15-year-old conversations. "Stanford has this amazing art program, but Professor Morrison thinks I should consider geology too. He says I have an intuitive understanding of rock formations." Sarah smiled at the idea of her son inheriting Pete Morrison's passion for stone and earth. The professor had become an unofficial part of their family, joining them for holidays and serving as an advisor to the foundation's environmental initiatives. "You could double major," Emma suggested, with the confident practicality of someone who'd grown up watching impossible things become routine. "Or you could just study whatever makes you excited to get up in the morning." "What makes you excited to get up in the morning?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about her daughter's evolving dreams. "Helping people,"
like you do, but maybe with medicine instead of money. I want to be the kind of doctor who takes care of people who can't afford fancy hospitals." Sarah felt the familiar swell of pride mixed with amazement that accompanied watching her children grow into themselves. They'd inherited her stubbornness and Elena's faith, but they'd also developed a kind of confidence that came from growing up in a family where extraordinary things were possible if you were willing to work for them. "Can I tell you both something?" Sarah said, pulling them closer as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "The marble changed our circumstances, but it didn't change who we are. You are already brave, already kind, already everything that matters most. The money just gave us more ways to share those qualities with other people." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the quarry water reflect the emerging starlight. Somewhere in the distance, Sarah could hear the sounds of the evening shift change at the marble operation, workers heading home to families and dinners, and the ordinary miracles of another day survived and celebrated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Victoria Ashford. "Saw the Forbes article preview online. Beautiful work, as always. Elena would be proud." She typed back, "She planted the seeds. We're just tending the garden." But as she sent the message, Sarah realized that wasn't entirely accurate. Elena had planted seeds, yes, seeds of courage and determination and faith in the possibility of abundance. But Sarah had planted seeds too, in soil that had seemed hostile to growth. She'd planted hope in the space between desperation and surrender, had watered it with stubborn belief, and watched it bloom into something that fed entire communities of women who'd been told they weren't worth investing in. "I love you both more than all the marble in the quarry," she told her children, using their family's private measure of infinite value. "More than all the ice cream in the world?" Emma asked, recycling their old game. "More than all the art supplies ever made?" Marcus added. "More than all the princess lakes and fairy tale endings and impossible dreams that ever came true," Sarah confirmed, and meant every word. The stars reflected in the quarry water like scattered diamonds on a jeer, and Sarah smiled at the memory of 7-year-old Emma calling it a princess lake where magic lived. She'd been right, of course. Magic did live there. Not in the marble deposit that had made them wealthy, but in the moment when a desperate mother had decided to risk everything on the radical belief that her family deserved better than the scraps that other people were willing to offer. Some gambles, Sarah understood now, were never really about luck at all. They were about love. These moments still caught Sarah off guard, the way her decision to help other women had rippled outward in ways she'd never imagined. Jennifer's story was one of hundreds. Children who'd gone to college because their mothers had been able to start businesses. Families who'd found stability because someone had believed their dreams were worth investing in. "What are your plans after graduation?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about how this young woman would use her education. "I'm starting my own nonprofit," Jennifer said with the kind of confident determination that reminded Sarah of herself 15 years earlier. "Supporting immigrant women who want to start businesses but face language barriers and cultural obstacles. I'm calling it the Golden Thread Foundation." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came with witnessing the next generation take up the work of transformation. "That sounds like exactly what the world needs. Let me give you my card. I'd love to hear more about your plans." After the ceremony, the family gathered for dinner at a restaurant overlooking Boston Harbor. Marcus had invited his girlfriend Anna, a brilliant young woman from El Salvador who was pursuing her doctorate in environmental engineering. Emma was deep in conversation with Pete Morrison, who'd flown in for the graduation and was explaining some new geological discovery that had him practically vibrating with excitement. Victoria Ashford, now in her 70s, but still sharp as diamond, raised her glass for a toast. "To Marcus, who's proven that good judgment runs in the Martinez family, and to all of us for having the wisdom to bet on each other." Sarah looked around the table at this chosen family they'd built over the years. Joe Brennan and his wife Martha, Pete Morrison with his endless enthusiasm for rocks and stones, Victoria with her gracious wisdom, Anna with her fierce intelligence, and her own children who'd grown into young adults she genuinely admired. "Actually," Marcus said, standing with his own glass, "I have an announcement to make. Anna and I have been talking about our future plans, and we've decided to move back to the Quarry region. We want to expand the sustainable mining operation and create a research center focused on ethical resource extraction in developing countries." The announcement sparked an animated discussion about environmental engineering and community development that lasted through dessert and into the walk along the harbor afterward. Sarah found herself walking beside Anna, this young woman who might become part of our family and who reminded her so much of herself at that age. Brilliant, determined, willing to take risks for the possibility of making the world better. "Anna tells me you're concerned about us moving back to such a small community," she said with the directness that Sarah had come to appreciate. "I want you to know that I understand what you built there. The foundation, the mining operation, the way you transformed a desperate situation into something that helps entire communities. I don't take lightly the responsibility of becoming part of that legacy." Sarah stopped walking and looked at this young woman who'd grown up in poverty in San Salvador, who'd earned scholarships and worked multiple jobs to put herself through school, who'd chosen to study environmental engineering because she wanted to help communities protect their natural resources while building economic stability. "Anna," she said carefully, "I'm not concerned about you joining our work. I'm thrilled about it. What I'm concerned about is the pressure you might feel to live up to some mythical version of what we've accomplished. The truth is, we've made it up as we went along, guided by love and stubbornness and dumb luck. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to care." Anna's smile reminded Sarah of Emma at 7, full of faith in the possibility of magic. "I care," she said simply, "and I'm not afraid of making it up as I go along." 15 years later, the documentary crew arrived at the quarry on a crisp October morning, their equipment trucks winding up the familiar mountain roads like a mechanical caravan. Sarah watched them set up from her office in the research center that Marcus and Anna had built on the site's western edge, a LEED-certified building that housed laboratories, conference rooms, and a library focused on sustainable resource management. The documentary was part of a series called American Dreamers, and Sarah had finally agreed to participate after years of declining similar requests. At 57, she'd learned to be more comfortable with her role as a public figure, understanding that her story could inspire other women to take the risks that might change their lives. Emma, now 27 and fresh from completing her residency in family medicine, had driven up from the city clinic where she worked in an underserved community. She inherited her mother's impulse to help people who'd been overlooked by more conventional systems, and her medical practice reflected the same values that had guided the foundation's development. "The producer wants to film the interview at the exact spot where you made the decision to bid. She thinks the visual contrast between then and now will be powerful."
Sarah looked out at the quarry site, now a carefully managed operation that employed over 300 people and served as a model for ethical mining practices worldwide. The marble extraction continued, but it was balanced with environmental restoration, community development, and the research center's work on sustainable resource management. What had once been an abandoned scar on the landscape had become a symbol of how industry and environmental stewardship could coexist. The spot where she'd stood 15 years earlier, desperate and afraid, and betting her last $1,000 on an impossible hope, was now marked by a small bronze plaque that read, "Sometimes the most reasonable thing you can do is something completely unreasonable. Sarah Martinez, 2025. "Your grandmother would have loved this," Victoria Ashford said, joining them at the window. At 81, she moved more slowly, but her mind remained sharp as ever, and she continued to serve on the foundation's board with the same thoughtful wisdom that had guided Sarah through those early years of sudden wealth. Elena Martinez Foundation had expanded far beyond its original mission of helping single mothers. It now included job training programs, small business incubators, educational scholarships, and environmental initiatives.
The foundation had helped launch over 2,000 businesses, funded college educations for more than 5,000 students, and provided emergency assistance to tens of thousands of families facing crisis. But Sarah was most proud of the ripple effects, the way women who'd received help had gone on to help others, creating networks of support that extended far beyond anything the foundation could have built alone. Jennifer Chen's Golden Thread Foundation was just one example. There were dozens of similar organizations started by women who'd once stood in the foundation's offices, desperate and afraid, and hoping for a second chance. The documentary interview took place at sunset, with the quarry water reflecting the autumn sky like liquid gold. Sarah sat on the same limestone chunk where she'd made her desperate bid 15 years earlier, but now she was surrounded by evidence of what that decision had created: the research center, the sustainable mining operation, the administrative buildings of the foundation, and the carefully restored environmental areas where native plants had been encouraged to reclaim portions of the site. Looking back, the interviewer asked, do you think you would have made the same choice if you'd known what you know now about business and finance and the complexities of managing wealth? Sarah considered the question, thinking about all the mistakes they'd made along the way, all the learning that had happened through trial and error rather than formal education. If I'd known what I know now, I probably would have been too scared to take the risk, she said honestly. Knowledge can be paralyzing sometimes. It was ignorance and desperation that gave me the courage to do something that made no rational sense. What would you say to someone facing a similar decision today? Someone who's considering risking everything on an unlikely hope? Sarah looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the women who might be watching, who might be standing at their own crossroads between safety and possibility. I'd say that the biggest risk is usually not taking any risk at all. I'd say that other people's opinions about what's possible don't have to become the boundaries of your life. And I'd say that sometimes the thing that looks like a disaster is actually an opportunity in disguise. She paused, thinking about Elena's garden, about the vegetables that had grown in soil everyone said was too poor for cultivation. But mostly, I'd say that you're probably braver than you think you are, and that love for your children, for your dreams, for the person you might become, is a more reliable guide than fear. As the crew packed up their equipment, Sarah found herself alone at the quarry's edge for the first time in months. The operational areas were quiet now, the day shift having ended and the evening shift not yet begun. In the growing darkness, she could see lights beginning to twinkle in the valley below, homes where families were gathering for dinner, where children were doing homework, where people were living the ordinary miracles of another day survived and celebrated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Watched the documentary preview online. You made Elena proud. You made all of us proud. Another message followed from Emma. Thank you for teaching us that impossible things are just difficult things that haven't been figured out yet. Sarah smiled, thinking about her children, now adults with their own careers and relationships and dreams, but the same people who'd sat beside her in that county courthouse 15 years ago and watched her bet everything on hope. Marcus had married Anna 2 years earlier in a ceremony at the quarry site, surrounded by family and friends and the community they'd all helped build together. Emma was dating a fellow doctor, a kind man who shared her commitment to serving underserved populations, and Sarah could see wedding bills in their not-too-distant future.
But more than their professional successes or personal happiness, Sarah was proud of who her children had become as human beings. They'd inherited Elena's faith and Sarah's stubbornness, but they'd also developed the kind of confidence that came from growing up in a family where extraordinary things were possible if you were willing to work for them. They understood that wealth was a responsibility as much as a privilege, and they'd chosen careers focused on service rather than accumulation. A meteor streaked across the sky above the quarry, burning bright for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. Sarah made a wish the way Elena had taught her, not for more money or recognition or success, but for the wisdom to use what she'd been given in ways that honored both the gift and the giver. As she walked back toward her car, Sarah thought about the woman she'd been 15 years ago. Desperate,
afraid, convinced that she was running out of options. That woman could never have imagined the life Sarah was living now, could never have envisioned the foundation or the research center, or the hundreds of families whose lives had been changed by a single impossible decision. But she could have imagined the love that had motivated that decision. She could have imagined the fierce determination to provide something better for her children. She could have imagined the stubborn refusal to accept that her family's story had to end in defeat. The rest, the marble deposit, the money, the public recognition, had been luck and blessing and the kind of grace that sometimes rewarded courage, even when courage seemed foolish. But the courage itself, the willingness to risk everything on hope, had come from the same place that still guided Sarah's decisions. The understanding that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win, especially then. 20 years later. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in spring, hand-delivered by a young woman who looked nervous but determined as she stood on Sarah's doorstep. At 62, Sarah had retired from the day-to-day operations of the foundation, though she remained active on the board and continued to mentor new entrepreneurs through the Small Business Incubator program. Miss Martinez, my name is Sofia Reyes. I'm a graduate student at the university working on my master's thesis about economic development in rural communities. Professor Morrison suggested I talk with you. Sarah invited Sofia in for coffee, recognizing in the young woman's earnest intensity something familiar, the particular combination of intelligence and determination that reminded her of her younger self. Sofia's thesis focused on the Martinez model, the approach to community development that had emerged from the foundation's work and was now being studied and replicated in communities across the country. What I'm trying to understand, Sofia said, settling into the comfortable chair by the window that looked out over Sarah's garden, is how you knew that your individual success could be transformed into systematic change. Most people who experience sudden wealth focus on personal security or lifestyle improvements. What made you think bigger than that? Sarah poured coffee from the pot she'd learned to keep ready for the steady stream of researchers, journalists, and aspiring entrepreneurs who found their way to her door. The question was one she'd been asked hundreds of times over the years, but she'd never quite found a satisfactory answer. I don't think I knew anything, she said, honestly. I was just trying to honor my grandmother's memory and figure out what to do with more money than I could comprehend. The foundation started because I remembered what it felt like to be desperate and alone, and I wanted other women to have options I didn't have.
But it became something much larger than individual assistance, Sofia pressed. The job training programs, the environmental initiatives, the research center, that's systematic thinking about poverty and opportunity. That's policy-level work disguised as private charity. Sarah smiled at the young woman's persistence, remembering her own graduate school enthusiasm for understanding how things worked and why they succeeded or failed. I think it grew that way because we started listening to the women we were trying to help. They didn't just need money. They needed childcare, job skills, business mentoring, networks of support. So we kept expanding our services to meet the actual needs rather than the needs we thought they should have. She walked to her desk and pulled out a folder she'd been saving for just this kind of conversation. Correspondence from foundation recipients over the years. Updates on businesses and families and dreams that had been nurtured into reality. Here, she said, handing Sofia a letter that had arrived just last week. This is from Maria Santos. You remember the woman who started the catering business. Her daughter just graduated from medical school and is opening a practice in the same community where Maria grew up. That's the real success story. Not the money we gave Maria, but the opportunities her success created for the next generation. Sofia read the letter carefully, making notes in the margin of her legal pad.
This is exactly what I'm trying to capture in my research, the multi-generational impact of economic development that's rooted in community rather than extraction. What are you planning to do with your degree? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about this young woman's aspirations. I want to work for the State Department, Sophia said, with the kind of confident determination that reminded Sarah of Emma at that age. Specifically, I want to help develop international aid programs that are based on the Martinez model, supporting local entrepreneurship rather than creating dependency on outside resources. Sarah felt the familiar stirring of excitement that came with encountering the next generation ready to take up the work of transformation. That sounds like exactly what the world needs. Have you considered applying for one of our international fellowships? We've been funding young professionals who want to adapt our model for different cultural contexts. The conversation continued through lunch and into the afternoon, covering everything from microfinance theory to the cultural barriers that prevented women in traditional societies from accessing business opportunities. By the time Sophia left, Sarah had agreed to serve as a thesis advisor and had connected her with contacts at the State Department who specialized in economic development policy. That evening, Sarah sat in her garden watching the sunset paint the sky above the quarry in shades of gold and rose. The marble operation continued to thrive under Marcus and Anna's leadership, but it was no longer the center of Sarah's attention. At 62, she'd learned to step back and let the next generation carry forward the work she'd started, offering guidance when asked, but trusting others to make their own mistakes and discoveries. Emma had opened her own practice the year before, a family medicine clinic that served migrant workers and their families in the agricultural communities south of the city. She'd inherited her mother's instinct for finding the people who needed help most and her grandmother's faith that small actions could create large changes. Just last month, she'd been featured in a medical journal for her innovative approach to providing health care in communities where traditional insurance models didn't work. Marcus and Anna's work had expanded beyond the quarry to include consulting with mining operations around the world, helping communities negotiate contracts that prioritized environmental protection and local economic development. They'd become leaders in the field of ethical resource extraction, traveling regularly to speak at conferences and advise governments on sustainable development practices. Victoria Ashford had passed away the previous winter, surrounded by family and friends in the same gracious home where she'd lived for 60 years. She left the bulk of her estate to the foundation, ensuring that its work could continue for generations to come. But more than the financial gift, she left a legacy of wisdom about how wealth could be used as a tool for justice rather than just personal comfort. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah found herself thinking about time and change and the unexpected directions that life could take when you were brave enough to follow your instincts rather than other people's expectations. 20 years ago, she was a desperate single mother betting her last $1,000 on an impossible hope. Tonight, she was surrounded by evidence of what that hope had created, not just for her own family, but for thousands of families who'd been given the chance to bet on themselves. Her phone rang, interrupting her reverie. The caller ID showed Emma's number, and Sarah smiled as she answered. "Hi, sweetheart. How was your day?" "Busy, but good." Emma's voice carried the particular exhaustion that came from meaningful work. "I wanted to call and thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For teaching me that helping people isn't charity, it's justice. One of my patients today was a young mother whose situation reminded me so much of yours 20 years ago. Desperate, afraid, convinced she was out of options. I was able to connect her with some resources, help her see that there were possibilities she hadn't considered." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, thinking about the circle that connected her grandmother's garden to Emma's medical practice, about the way love and service could be passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. "You don't need to thank me for that, baby. That's just who you are." "It's who we are," Emma corrected gently. "It's who our family chooses to be. I love you, Mom." After they hung up, Sarah remained in the garden until full darkness fell, listening to the night sounds of the mountain, owls calling from the forest, the distant hum of the quarry's evening operations, the soft whisper of wind through the trees that Elena had loved so much. Tomorrow, she would meet with Sophia again to discuss the young woman's research. Next week, she had a speaking engagement at a conference on rural economic development. Next month, she would travel to Guatemala with Marcus and Anna to consult on a mining project that aimed to provide economic opportunities for indigenous communities while protecting their traditional lands. But tonight, she was simply a woman sitting in her garden, surrounded by the evidence of what was possible when you chose hope over fear, courage over safety, and love over everything else that the world insisted was more practical. The quarry water reflected the stars like scattered promises, and Sarah smiled at the memory of 7-year-old Emma calling it a princess lake where magic lived. She'd been right, of course. Magic did live there. Not in the marble deposit that had made them wealthy, but in the moment when a desperate mother decided that her family deserved better than the scraps that other people were willing to offer. 20 years later, that magic was still growing, still spreading, still proving that sometimes the most reasonable thing you can do is something completely unreasonable. Some seeds, Sarah understood now, were planted not for the harvest you could see, but for the forests that might grow long after you were gone. Sarah's story proves that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all. If her journey from a single mother facing eviction to building a $160 million empire inspired you to believe in your own impossible dreams, please like this video, subscribe for more incredible true stories, and share this with someone who needs to remember that courage can change everything. What impossible dream are you ready to bet on? Let us know in the comments below.